So why did the US invade Iraq? I mean, the official reasons are practically burned into our collective memory, right? Weapons of mass destruction, a direct response to 9/11. But what if the real story is something else entirely? What if it's far more deliberate and frankly far more unsettling? Today, we're going to dig into the evidence for a premeditated vision that really drove the march to war.
Just think about this for a second. What if the invasion wasn't some tragic mistake born from faulty intelligence, but a deliberate choice that was just looking for a justification? That one question, it changes everything. It shifts the whole narrative from a terrible blunder to a preconceived plan.
Okay, so to really get our heads around how this happened, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the official story we were all told. Then, we're going to meet the architects who were pushing for this war behind the scenes. We'll explore the powerful psychological need for a victory, see how the whole mission just unraveled, and finally, we have to confront its absolutely destructive legacy. All right, let's start with the public case for war. This is the story that convinced millions of people all around the world that an invasion wasn't just necessary, but that it was just. And that public narrative was crystal clear, and honestly, pretty terrifying. Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and he was linked to the 9/11 terrorists. Simple. Scary. But here's the thing. While that story was being sold to the public, the intelligence community, well, they were looking at a completely different picture. The evidence just wasn't there.
And we're not talking about some small disagreement here. No. Just days after the 9/11 attacks, the president's own counterterrorism chief said it with total clarity. This quote, it just reveals this massive, gaping chasm between what the actual experts knew and the story the world was about to be told.
So you have to ask, right? If the intelligence wasn't pointing to Iraq, who was? And that brings us to the key architects inside the administration who almost immediately started a private conversation to shift the entire focus of the country. The speed of this pivot is just staggering. On the actual night of 9/11, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz was already telling intel agencies to find a link to Iraq. By that weekend, just a few days later, he's at Camp David, going over the heads of his own bosses to pitch an invasion plan directly to the president. And the plan itself? Well, it sounded almost seductively simple. This wasn't about a huge, messy occupation. The idea was to just quickly seize control of the Kurdish areas in the north and the Shia areas in the south, grab the major oil fields, and just like that, you've cut Saddam Hussein off at the knees. Wolfowitz even had this powerful phrase to sum it all up. The goal wasn't even necessarily to remove Saddam. It was to make him powerless, to basically reduce him to the mayor of Baghdad. See? It sounds like a limited, clean, decisive strike, something totally achievable.
But this whole push for war, it wasn't just about strategy. No, to really understand why this idea was so appealing, we have to look at the psychology of the moment. Because in the wake of 9/11, there was this powerful, unspoken need for a clear, satisfying victory.
Think about it. Fighting al-Qaeda, this shadowy group hiding out in caves in Afghanistan, it was just frustrating. It was like trying to hit smoke with a baseball bat. But invading Iraq? Oh, now that offered a conventional army, a capital city you could capture, a dictator you could topple. It was a tangible target. It was a symbolic home run for a nation that felt so wounded and vulnerable. And this is where a classic psychological trap snapshot: confirmation bias. The moment the decision was made to target Iraq, everything changed. Policies started driving the intelligence, not the other way around. Every flimsy piece of intel, every rumor, was suddenly seen as proof, reinforcing a conclusion that had already been decided. And this quote from Vice President Cheney perfectly illustrates the end result of that bias. All the internal speculation, all the thin, threadbare evidence, it gets transformed into these public statements of absolute, unshakable certainty. This quote left zero room for debate, even though we now know that behind the scenes there was an enormous amount of So, the war began, Baghdad fell pretty quickly, and for a minute, it seemed like the vision had actually worked. But that home run victory lap was tragically short-lived. The mission rapidly unraveled into a chaotic, violent, and completely new reality. I mean, we've all seen this image, right? It's become iconic for a reason. That mission accomplished banner. It represented the absolute peak of the fantasy, the clean, decisive victory that had been imagined from the very beginning. But the reality on the ground was that the real war, the insurgency, the bloodshed, it was all just getting started.
And you know, one of the very first decisions made after the invasion turned out to be one of the most catastrophic, dissolving the entire Iraqi army. Just poof, gone. In an instant, you have hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers who are now unemployed, armed, and furious. They became the backbone of a new, powerful insurgency. And from those very ranks, a group called al-Qaeda in Iraq would eventually morph into the group we all know as ISIS.
So this brings us to the war's true legacy. The cost wasn't just strategic. It was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, trillions of dollars, and an entire region plunged into chaos.
Let's just start with the human toll. It's estimated that over 200,000 Iraqis, civilians and combatants, were killed. That number is so large, it's almost impossible to comprehend. It represents an immeasurable amount of loss and suffering. This chart really puts the scale into stark perspective. Just look at that bar for Iraqi deaths, over 200,000. It absolutely dwarfs the tragic loss of nearly 10,000 American service members. And then you see the financial cost, just soaring past $1 trillion. These aren't just numbers, they're the tangible, devastating consequences of that invasion.
And this comparison? Well, this is perhaps the most sobering of all. Look, Saddam's regime was undeniably brutal. It killed an estimated 250,000 people over a quarter of a century. But now look at the war. A comparable number of deaths in just 8 years. And the result wasn't liberation. It was a power vacuum that gave birth to ISIS and destabilized the entire region.
So at the end of the day, when you look at it through this lens, the Iraq War wasn't a mission based on solid intelligence. It was a story. It was a fantasy, really, constructed out of fear and this deep desire to project strength, a desire to be the hero after the trauma of 9/11.
And this all leaves us with one final, critical question. The Iraq War serves as this tragic, real-world lesson in what happens when a compelling story, one that fulfills a deep psychological need, becomes more powerful than the actual truth. It's a question about the dangerous relationship between narrative and power that is, unfortunately, just as relevant today as it was then.